Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 6. Chapter 6 deals with nonverbal communication, and in this chapter, we will be looking at the various principles of nonverbal communication. We will also be looking at conscious versus unconscious nonverbal communication, and we will also be looking at various ways that we can think about strategically managing nonverbal communication so that we can be more effective in our relationships. Ralph Waldo Emerson stated, "What you are speaks so loudly, I cannot hear what you say." What do you think this statement means? What kinds of messages do nonverbal cues convey to other people? Have we ever found ourselves in situations where a person looked a certain way and so we were distracted in terms of listening to what they were saying? Is it possible that we have been in situations where other people have had a difficult time listening to what we were saying because of our visual cues? These are things that are definitely worth considering when we think about interpersonal communication and interpersonal communication effectiveness. When talking about types of nonverbal communication, there are two different components. The first of these is vocal communication. Vocal nonverbal communication deals with things like pitch, volume, and breathing. So pitch deals with how high or how low your pitch is. Some people talk kind of like this, while others have a very low pitch. Some people talk very softly, and others talk very loudly all the time. Some people you meet might talk kind of breathy, right? Whereas other people speak in a very clear manner without breathiness. These are all different types of vocal nonverbal communication that influence the ways that we relate to people and the ways that they relate to us. There are also non-vocal aspects of nonverbal communication. These deal with things like appearance. So, what do you look like? What kinds of gestures do you use? So things like hand movements, arm gestures, body gestures, things like that. How do you move your body? Do you stand in a straight, good posture, or do you slouch? What kinds of facial expressions do you use? Do you have an open face that seeks to understand? Or do you have facial expressions that maybe convey the opposite to people? What kinds of eye behavior or oculesic behavior do you use? What kinds of oculesic behavior is most effective in various situations? And finally, how do we use touch? We use touch in many different ways, right? We touch people on the shoulder who we're friends with to try to show support. We might pat someone on the back, right? That's a good friend of ours, or maybe a social partner or a social colleague that we know. We have more close touch with people that we are close to, like family members or intimate partners. So all of these aspects of nonverbal communication are very important in terms of how we create meaning with other people. And so we're going to go into various aspects of nonverbal communication in this chapter. And hopefully this will enable us a greater understanding of the importance of nonverbal communication, and it will also hopefully give you an idea about the ways that you can strategically modify your nonverbal communication when you want to in order to give a desired outcome. There are several characteristics of nonverbal communication, and we're going to go through each of these one by one now. The first characteristic is that nonverbal communication skills are important. Well, why are they so important? Well, first of all, nonverbal communication skills deals with our ability to interpret the nonverbal codes or the nonverbal cues that other people give us, right? So what are other people showing us on their face? Are we reading them correctly? And do we have the skills to use appropriate, effective nonverbal facial cues in response to them? People who have good nonverbal communication skills tend to also be perceived by others as more attractive, more popular, and they also tend to experience a greater sense of well-being, primarily because they probably have relationships that are more harmonious than people that are not good at decoding nonverbal cues. People who are good at nonverbal communication are also more persuasive. This tends to be the case because you can, a lot of times, if you're good at reading facial expressions, for example, you can oftentimes see what people are not saying to you if you're able to read cues on their face or in their body, right? So if I'm able to read someone's face and I can see that when I ask them something like, "How are you doing today?" and they say, "I'm fine," right? I might look at their face and I can see that this person is not fine. And because I'm able to decode that, I can then follow up and try to figure out what's really going on with them, which of course allows me to be a better teacher, a better partner, a better friend, a better parent, or whatever, okay? So people who are good at decoding nonverbal skills and also people that are good at giving the right types of nonverbal skills out in terms of the nonverbal cues that they put out there, those people are more persuasive in their relationships with other people. In addition, people who are good at nonverbal communication also tend to experience more success in their professional careers, and they also tend to have happier relationships that last longer. So these are all reasons why nonverbal communication skills are very important. Another characteristic of nonverbal communication is that all behavior has communicated value. What does this mean? Well, even if you are someone who does not give off any nonverbal cues in your face and you have a totally deadpan face all the time, people will also assign meaning to that. Does that make sense? So even if you do not give off very many nonverbal cues, the lack of nonverbal expression is something that people will assign meaning to. Unfortunately, if you do not give off very much nonverbal communication, sometimes people might view individuals like that as being withdrawn or potentially deceptive. It's also important to realize that nonverbal communication has a conscious component. So we choose to do things with our face, for example, when we hear that someone has had something really fabulous happen. So let's say your friend tells you that they won the lottery, right? Obviously, their face is going to be excited and happy, and you're consciously or unconsciously going to also have a happy face, right? So you're going to choose to create more of a open expression. Your eyes are going to maybe rise and your eyebrows would rise. You'd probably put a smile on your face to try to show your enjoyment or your happiness for them. Similarly, when somebody tells you something very sad, you're probably going to consciously work to try to match their face so that you seem like you're responding appropriately. So we do engage in nonverbal communication consciously, but we also engage in nonverbal communication unconsciously. And there's actually been some interesting research that has shown that the human brain has something called mirror neurons, and these mirror neurons tend to align in between people. So for example, if you and I are having a conversation and we are creating a really great sense of like meaning, and we're really understanding each other, and we're both really enjoying the conversation. There's evidence by neuroscientists that's been recently coming out that shows that people actually tend to have similarities in terms of how their mirror neurons are firing when they have these kinds of conversations. And so it's very interesting to look at the interaction between communication and effective communication and the way that the brain actually processes information, and how people tend to become more similar in terms of their mirror neuron processes when there is effective communication taking place. Obviously, that would be an example of unconscious communication behavior or unconscious effects of good nonverbal communication. Some of the unconscious nonverbal communication that you might have experienced in your life so far could include things like blushing or sweating. Pupil dilation is also something that people are not really able to control usually. I know sometimes when you are talking about a situation or a person that you particularly like, the others that you're talking with might be able to tell what your real feelings are about a situation because you might blush, right? However, some of the more conscious types of nonverbal behavior include things like nodding our head, using strategic facial features so that we are being appropriate given the communication situation we're in. Unconscious and conscious communication also can deal with things like how do we dress ourselves or attire ourselves or decorate our bodies, right? Those are very conscious choices usually. People consciously decide what kind of clothing they're going to wear. They consciously decide how they'll style their hair or whether they will wear earrings or jewelry or not. People are deliberative about things like whether they wear makeup or not, or whether they lift weights so that they have strong muscles or not, right? So these are things that people consciously do. However, it's always important to remember that there are lots of unconscious nonverbal cues that all of us are giving out. And sometimes people may see more than you realize that they see. And so this is one of the reasons why it is in our benefit to start to learn some of these nonverbal cues a little bit more so that we can figure out how to manage them and modify them in certain situations so that we can be more effective communicators. A third characteristic of nonverbal communication is that nonverbal communication is mostly relational. So, for example, we use nonverbal communication to manage our own personal identity. I stated on a previous slide already in this lecture that the way that we decorate ourselves or the way that we stylize ourselves, the way that we style our hair or the way that we walk or stand, these are all different types of identity cues that we give out to people. Some college students like to wear sports shirts or sports jackets to show that they're a part of a sports team or that they are affiliated with the university sports group. Other students like to wear sweatshirts or t-shirts that mark a membership with a fraternity or a sorority. And other students like to wear other types of shirts, maybe the students that are part of the marching band, or maybe they're part of an acting club on campus, right? These are all ways that we mark identity with nonverbal communication. In addition, we also tend to stylize ourselves based on different types of feminine or masculine cues. So these tend to be socialized. So for many of us, we grew up learning from our family and from society and from the media what types of nonverbal cues were expected to be appropriate for us in terms of our sex and gender. So for example, most women are very aware of the fact that attractiveness is seen as a very important part of female identity. And so what does this mean for women in terms of identity management? Well, a lot of times I notice that female students, they may tend to dress in very stylish clothing, right? And sometimes people are very tuned in to the various fashions that are in right now. And so women on campus might dress based on the fashions that are popular right now. They may stylize their hair in ways that are considered to be more feminine or more soft. They may do things like wear makeup so that they can enhance their physical beauty. They may do things like wear jewelry or earrings or use backpacks or purses or shoes, right? These are all ways that women can stylize their identity so that they appear more feminine if that's what they choose to do. Now, some women don't want to appear super feminine, and some women just want to dress in what's comfortable. And so in those types of situations, people may actually go out of their way to avoid using certain types of nonverbal cues that might mark them as especially feminine. So for example, I know of some women who wear pants all the time. I have had some friends in my life that I have never seen, female friends, and I have never seen them wear a skirt or a dress, right? So there's various ways that people learn about things like gender and gender expression, and there are various ways that we manage our nonverbal expression based on the value systems that we have and based on what we think is important. We can also look at masculine cues for identity management. Some men tend to think that it's important that they lift weights so that they can appear strong, right? Also, the way that a man stylizes his hair says something about who he is or who he wants to become, right? Nowadays, it's more common to see men wearing jewelry, whereas, 30 or 40 years ago, it was very uncommon to see men wearing things like earrings or, necklaces or whatever. So these are various ways that people stylize their identity, and nonverbal communication is relational in terms of how we stylize ourselves, because basically many of us are making strategic choices about what we wear, how we wear things that are based on our group membership, right? In addition, we might also behave and communicate nonverbally with other people based on these feminine and masculine cues. So for example, sometimes people may have certain ideas about what is considered to be polite behavior for a woman or polite behavior for a man, right? And so these ideas shape the way that we relate to each other and the way that we perceive other people. Nonverbal communication also defines relationships. So for example, we can convey to somebody nonverbally that we like them through things like smiling or a pat on the back, or maybe a hug if you see a friend that you haven't seen in a while. And also, nonverbal communication tends to convey emotions. We talked about this a few slides ago, but obviously we can convey emotions of closeness by using hugs or kisses or embracing, right, or hand holding. These are various ways that we talk about or communicate relationships and relationship value based on nonverbal communication. Another characteristic of nonverbal communication is that nonverbal communication serves many functions. So one of these functions might be repeating or reinforcing what's being said verbally. So for example, if someone were to ask you for directions, you would probably explain the directions to them verbally, and then you might use your arm or your hands to point in the direction in which they should go. So this is a good example of repeating functions of nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication also serves the complementing function of what we're talking about. So for example, if you are going to say to someone that you are feeling very happy today, obviously we would expect that your face would also show feelings of happiness rather than feelings of sadness or despair, right? Now, if we see a situation where somebody says that they're happy, but their face does not show those cues, chances are the person is probably either not feeling happy or the person does not really have the same level of nonverbal expression that you might be used to from other relationships. In addition, nonverbal communication can serve a substitution function. So sometimes maybe we don't want to have to say the word, or sometimes we don't want to have to spell something out verbally. So we might just use a nonverbal cue to try to get our point across in another way. So maybe you're having a conversation that you find particularly boring. So rather than telling somebody, I'm finding this conversation to be very boring, you might just sigh, right? Or maybe you'll roll your eyes if somebody says something to you that you don't like, and maybe it's not appropriate to tell them you don't like what they said. Or maybe you might be feeling, like you want to go home and go to sleep, and so you might yawn instead of saying, I want to go home and go to sleep. So these are all various ways that nonverbal communication can serve different functions, and we're going to go into a few more here in the next slide. Nonverbal communication also serves an accenting function. So you might use certain words with a certain type of emphasis to make a certain point, okay? So let's say somebody is accusing you of stealing their car or whatever. Hopefully none of you are stealing cars out there. That's not something I'm encouraging, but perhaps there is an accusation taking place. Most of the time, when you see that kind of interaction taking place, it's very likely that people will have a nonverbal cue going along with it. And usually a cue that includes an accusation will include a finger point, right? Nonverbal cues can also serve an important function in terms of regulating conversation. So for example, sometimes when I'm lecturing in front of a class, and let's say the lecture period is getting to the end of the class and we're getting near to the point where the class should be wrapping up, I might still be talking about something, and some of the students might start to shuffle papers, they might start to zip their backpacks up and put pens away, right? This is a way that the class is non-verbally regulating me as a public speaker. And basically what they're telling me when they start shuffling papers and putting their backpacks together is it's time to wrap this lecture up because we have to go, right? And so it serves as a regulating function in that it wouldn't really be appropriate for a student just to interrupt me in the middle of a lecture and say, are you going to wrap up soon? Because I have another class to get to, right? So instead of doing something that's rude, you might just non-verbally start to hint that we really need to get going because I have another class. Sometimes what you find is that people's verbal and nonverbal communication are not in alignment. And sometimes you find that people might give you mixed messages or contradictory messages. This is a very interesting situation because you're put in a situation where you have to decide whether you believe what they say or whether you believe what they're doing, right? What their face is telling you or what their actions are doing. Generally speaking, it's usually good to believe what people are doing rather than what they're saying. And if you're interested in looking into nonverbal communication a little bit more, I suggest that you look up a woman by the name of Janine Driver. She's a PhD in communication, and she has been working for the last 15 or 20 years working with corporate executives. She has also worked with the FBI and with law enforcement because she teaches people how to decode nonverbal cues so that they can actually see what people are saying, even when people don't actually tell them verbally what's going on. So Janine Driver is her name. I guarantee you that if you read one of her books or if you look her up on the web, she has several different types of audio clips or video clips that she's recorded on different shows. And she will give you lots of different information about ways that you can decode people's nonverbal cues to learn more about what they actually mean sometimes when they won't tell you what they actually feel. And being able to decode nonverbal cues is a very useful skill in interpersonal relationships and also in professional relationships. Another important characteristic of nonverbal communication is that nonverbal communication can be ambiguous. So what does this mean? Well, sometimes you might be talking with someone and you see them smirk at you. And you might be wondering, why are they smirking at me? I haven't said anything funny. So what does that smirk mean in that situation? Does it mean that they find what you said to be humorous? Does it mean that they're thinking of something else while you're talking, and so that different memory is making them smile or smirk? Maybe you have a big piece of lettuce in your teeth that you don't know about, and the person is watching you talk and you have lettuce in your teeth, right? Maybe they're smirking because of that. So we don't really know what a smirk means across the board for every person. But one of the things that Janine Driver talks about in her lectures and in her books about nonverbal communication is that if you want to be able to read people nonverbally, you have to figure out what their baseline nonverbal communication behavior is, right? So when we say baseline, what we mean is, what are the normal nonverbal and verbal communication behaviors that we see in this person generally when we communicate with them, okay? So if they tend to be someone who's fairly serious and we see that they're smirking, okay, chances are there is definitely something going on and they probably are having a response to something that you said, right? Especially if they tend to be a good listener and they don't tend to tune out when other people are listening. So it's always good to see what people's baseline communication behaviors are before you try to infer what the nonverbal cues mean. We can also look at things like silence, and what does silence mean in a situation, right? Some people might think of silence as a very comfortable way to pass the time with a friend. For other people, silence can mean that they are being dumped from a relationship, right? So these are very different types of assumptions or interpretations that people might have. So we do need to always be careful about assigning definite meaning based on nonverbal cues unless we know somebody very well, because the meanings that we assign may not always be correct. And this is why, in my experience, my ability to decode nonverbal cues is the best with people that I know very well, right? Because I know them, so I know what their normal communication is like. However, if you practice enough and if you read enough about it and if you study the issue long enough, you will start to become good at noticing nonverbal cues in strangers even that you did not even notice before. And more specifically, there are things like micro-expressions, and Janine Driver talks about micro-expressions. And most people are not really tuned into what micro-expressions are because they happen very, very quickly. And micro-expressions are facial expressions that exhibit the 7 human emotions, the 7 universal human emotions. So the universal human emotions tend to be happiness, sadness, fear, anger, disgust. I think there's a couple more, like confusion, and then I think there might be one more, okay? So the reason why studying or learning about micro-expressions is interesting is because people tend to hide micro-expressions because they are regulating their nonverbal communication. So for example, when we are young children, we are very open with our nonverbal cues, right? And this is why you might have a child, for example, that gets a plate of food put in front of them, and they may respond by looking at the plate of food with a sheer look of disgust on their face because the food does not look good to them, it does not smell good to them, they don't want to eat it, right? And so a child is not very likely to try to mask a feeling of disgust or a facial expression of disgust because children have not yet learned the idea of social appropriateness, right? And so the idea behind microexpressions and learning how to decode microexpressions is that human beings, especially adults, right, we tend to go around in our daily lives and we do a lot of masking, right? We put expressions on our face that we think are going to be appropriate given the situation. And similarly, we might work to hide certain expressions on our face that we don't think are going to be socially appropriate, right? So if you can learn how to look for micro expressions, or if you can learn how to understand what they are at least, that might help you a little bit more in terms of decoding people's nonverbal cues. Now, the trick with understanding micro expressions is that they don't tend to stay on people's faces for very long, and that's why you have to study this area a little bit in order to really see them. So, for example, one type of micro expression that you might start to see once you look into this issue a little more would be an expression where you see somebody's mouth, right? And you see their mouth sort of turn up in the corner, kind of into like a cheek pull, where they're turning their mouth up and they kind of suck the left, let's say they suck the left side of their mouth up into the corner, kind of like they're almost going to bite their cheek, but they don't quite bite it. That look, or that micro expression, which probably, by the way, won't last for more than a second, okay? People tend to put it on their face and then they tend to drop it. So that micro expression is actually an indicator of contempt, right? But if you didn't know anything about micro expressions, you wouldn't know what that look means. You might just think, oh, they have their mouth in a weird, shape or something, right? But because I study micro expressions and I know what they look like, I see a lot more in terms of nonverbal communication than the average person probably does. And certainly in a class like this, an interpersonal course for, introductory interpersonal communication course, you are not expected to learn how to read micro expressions. But I am just giving you this information because I have found that my ability to read people's faces has been a very useful skill in terms of being able to communicate effectively, because doing that, or being able to read facial expressions, allows us to see certain emotions playing out on people's faces that they probably would not ordinarily tell us that they're feeling. And so if you can read people's facial expressions, you can actually respond to the emotion that you're seeing, even if they don't tell you what they're feeling. And that can be a very useful skill in terms of effective relationships. There's also intimacy cues in nonverbal communication, and people have various interpretations for what a handshake means versus what a hug means versus what a kiss on the cheek means, right? So this is a very important part of nonverbal comm. And it's important to note that the positive facial cues tend to be more evident to most people than negative facial cues. So this is kind of an interesting area to think about. What it suggests is that we're going to maybe have to work a little harder to understand or to see what people are feeling when it's a negative emotion rather than a positive emotion. There are several influences in terms of nonverbal communication that can be based on gender. For example, it's probably not surprising to you to discover that women, generally speaking, tend to be more expressive with nonverbal cues than men, but women also tend to be better at decoding nonverbal cues than men as well. However, men tend to express nonverbally more physical dominance than women, right? So women tend to usually be shorter and maybe smaller in terms of physique, right? However, men are more physically dominant. They tend to be taller and they tend to weigh more. Usually men tend to have more muscles than women too, depending on who you're talking to. I've seen some athletes where, wow, people are buff, right? But what's interesting about nonverbal communication and the ability to decode nonverbal communication is that the research has shown that people who are in a low power position in a relationship tend to be more able to decode nonverbal cues than people who are in a higher power position in a relationship. So for example, let's say I'm at work and I have a boss. According to this research, in a lower level position compared to my boss, I would be better at decoding their nonverbal cues than they would be at decoding mine. Now, why would this be? Well, I'm sure that you can think of many benefits to being able to decode the cues of your boss, right? One being that if they're not happy with you and they're not telling you, you can work to try to remediate that situation before it becomes more of a bigger issue, right? So there are obviously many rewards in place for people that can correctly read nonverbal cues. However, you do want to be careful that you're not jumping to assumptions based on nonverbal cues. And this is why Janine Driver says that you always have to figure out what a person's baseline nonverbal behavior is before you try to make inferences about what their feelings are or what they're thinking. Culture is also a very strong influence in terms of nonverbal communication. So a lot of the similarities that we tend to see cross-culturally tend to deal with things like smiling or sadness, laughter, tears, things like that. However, there are many differences cross-culturally in terms of oculesic behavior, or how long we look into other people's eyes, or whether we make much eye contact with other people at all, right? In some cultures, it is considered to be a sign of respect if you look someone in the eye when they're talking. In other cultures, it is seen to be challenging or a sign of disrespect if you stare at someone for too long, right? We can also look at things like haptics or touch, and how do people use touch in their cultural systems. Touch is one area where people sometimes run into cultural misunderstandings. Also, we can look at things like proxemics, or how close do people stand to each other when they communicate. What are the space expectations for one culture versus another? There are many different types of nonverbal communication, and we're going to go through each of them one by one. One of the first types of nonverbal communication deals with body movement. So, in which direction are we orienting our body? A lot of times you can tell things about relationships, or how much people like each other, or whether they want to be in a conversation with somebody based on whether they orient their body towards somebody or away from somebody, right? So obviously, if we are orienting ourselves towards somebody, that conveys interest, that conveys inclusion, that conveys that we want to communicate with them. However, if we orient our body away from somebody, that can send the message that we're not interested in communicating or connecting with them. We also tend to communicate a good deal about ourselves based on the posture that we use. Do we stand up straight? Do we sit straight? A lot of times people will make assumptions about your personality or how you're feeling based on whether you hold yourself up in a good posture position or whether you're slouching. In addition, facial and eye expressions also tend to be a very important type of nonverbal communication. So we can look at things like oculesic behavior, or how we use our eyes. A lot of times the ways that people use their eyes for communication can sometimes be ambiguous. So again, you always want to know what someone's baseline communication style is before you try to make any kinds of assumptions about what their meaning is. Another type of nonverbal communication that's important is the use of gestures. So gestures include using our hands or arms in order to communicate to somebody a little more meaning about what we're talking about, right? So we can use illustrators, which oftentimes we use with speech. So I gave the example of pointing directions, right? And that's a type of an illustrator that we use when we're verbally giving someone directions. We use our arms to point in the direction that they should go so that we're more clear. We might also use nonverbal communication in terms of emblems. So emblems are types of nonverbal cues that stand alone, that do not need verbal communication to be understood. So fairly universal emblems tend to be like a head nod or a waving, right? Those tend to be examples of emblems that we tend to see used fairly frequently. However, another type of nonverbal communication, which might be unconscious or not consciously performed, are the use of adapters. And adapters include things that we might do when we're nervous or when we're cold. So you might shiver when you're cold. You might, pull at the side of your jacket or something when you're nervous. Some people they click their pens on and off, right? They click the pen open and closed or something when they're nervous. These are various examples of adapters, and a lot of times people are not even aware that they're doing these kinds of adapters, but what's important about understanding that is that people will still develop impressions about you even if you're not conscious that you're using certain nonverbal cues. And this is why in this course we talk about nonverbal communication, so that we can all learn to see what types of nonverbal communication we use very well and what types of nonverbal communication we could improve upon. And then when we are able to see those areas where we can improve, we can make more strategic decisions about managing our nonverbal communication so we can be the most effective as possible when we relate with other people. In addition, voice is another type of nonverbal communication that's very important to understand. Now, I know that some people are sitting here going, why are we talking about voice when we're talking about nonverbal communication? Well, voice or paralanguage is actually a component of nonverbal communication. When we're talking about strictly verbal communication, we're primarily looking at the words that people use to convey ideas. But the way that people deliver those words is actually a nonverbal issue. So for example, how quickly are you speaking? What kind of volume do you use? Do you use pauses, or do you tend to use other types of nonverbal cues that can shape how people perceive you? You can also use voice to emphasize certain points, right? So for example, I'm going to say this sentence here, I didn't steal your dog, and I'm going to say it 3 different ways. And depending on the type of vocal emphasis I put on a certain word in the sentence, there is a different meaning that people would take from the sentence. So let me start with the first example. I didn't steal your dog. Okay, so in that situation, I emphasized the I. So when I said that I didn't steal your dog, I'm stating basically, I didn't steal your dog, but somebody else did, right? Okay, here's the second example. Second example goes like this. I didn't steal your dog. So emphasizing the word steal conveys the meaning that I didn't actually steal the dog. I was just borrowing the dog, or I just took the dog for a walk, right? Okay, here's the third example. I didn't steal your dog. Okay, so the third example, hopefully, conveys to you that I didn't steal your dog, but I may have stole your cat, right? So each word that we place emphasis on can change the meaning of a sentence that otherwise would have identical meaning, right, if it wasn't being modified by a certain vocal emphasis. We can also look at things like vocal or voice disfluencies in terms of how they shape communication. So you can think of people who do a lot of stammering or perhaps stuttering. You can also think of people who use a lot of hedge words. Hedge words are things like, like, you know, okay, things like that. Those tend to be verbal disfluencies that tend to shape how people perceive other people. More specifically, using hedging or powerless speech tends to reduce perceptions of credibility and perceptions of professionalism and competence. So I would like you to maybe think back on the last time you were listening to a lecture. Maybe it was a lecture by a professor, maybe it was a lecture by another student, and think of a situation where the person who was speaking was saying the word like, you know, and I have been on the receiving end of speakers like that, and I can tell you that it is very distracting to listen to someone who is speaking when they speak with a lot of hedge words or other powerless speech markers. So what this means for us in terms of communication and communication competence is that we want to learn to become good self-monitors so that we can start to hear the words that we're saying and the way that we're speaking as we're speaking them, because when you get to be a good self-monitor, you can make more strategic decisions about using hedge words or not, right? Now, there also is some research on the use of powerless speech that shows that powerless speech can also be used to enact face saving for other people. So using hedge words or powerless speech is not necessarily a bad thing all the time. It can be evoked strategically for an ideal communication outcome. But the main point that you should take away from this slide is that most of us tend to use hedge words probably more than we realize. And if you really want to become a proficient communicator, especially a good public speaker, you really want to start to pay attention to the kinds of speech disfluencies that you might have, because that can help you to reduce those disfluencies so that people can actually pay more attention to the message that you're trying to convey rather than attending to the disfluencies that are playing out when you speak. Touch is another type of nonverbal communication, and the word for touch that is commonly used in communication textbooks is haptics. And so there's various types of touch that we tend to engage in a routine basis in our daily lives. And when we look at functional or professional touch interactions, we can think about things like, when we go to a doctor, it is considered to be appropriate for them to touch us in certain places where they have to do an examination. Same can be said for going to the dentist, right? And typically speaking, you would not let most people, get in your mouth with instruments to clean your teeth, but because you're at the dentist, that is commonly seen as normal, professional, functional touch behavior. We might also have touch behavior in terms of social politeness norms. So a handshake is considered to be the standard, the business professional standard for meeting new people. So that tends to be the norm when we communicate. But you might also see that haptics is used to communicate friendship and warmth, such as what you would see in terms of giving a kiss on the cheek to an old friend, or giving a hug to a brother or an auntie or something like that. And we can also look at physical intimacy and the ways in which haptics tend to guide physical intimacy touching. So this includes things like more intimate touching, like hand holding, maybe caressing, or embraces. This would also include kissing and things like that. And obviously, aggression or physical touch aggression would include things like slaps, shoving, or other even more worse aggression. And clearly, aggressive nonverbal communication is something that is not desirable, it is dangerous, and it is very unhealthy in relationships. If you or somebody you know is in a relationship right now where there is physical aggression, I strongly encourage you to seek help with Alternatives to Violence so that you can get some ideas on how to get away from someone who may be aggressive in a relationship. The research on physical aggression in relationships, especially romantic relationships, shows that if somebody will hit their romantic partner once, that they will continue to do it over and over and over again. So if you happen to be in a relationship with someone who has gotten physically aggressive with you, the chances are that they will continue to be aggressive in the future, even if they don't want to, because a lot of times things like physical aggression are learned in the home. And so these are types of relational patterns that people pick up at a very young age, and they learn that it's considered to be appropriate or normal. And so in order to remediate those types of unhealthy communication in relationships, there does need to be long-term counseling in place to stop people from being physically aggressive in relationships. So if somebody that you know is in a relationship with someone who's physically aggressive, it is probably a good idea to inform them that physical aggression almost never tends to improve without some kind of professional counseling help, okay? And also, if you or someone you know is in an aggressive situation, I strongly urge you to seek help from Alternatives to Violence so that you can get ideas about how to stay safe And also, I strongly encourage you to seek counseling from the University Counseling Center so that you can learn about how to set boundaries and perhaps keep yourself safer in the future from these kinds of people or situations. Another type of nonverbal communication deals with physical appearance. And physical appearance tends to be extremely important in terms of the first impressions that people may develop about other people. And what's interesting is that people tend to hold on to the first impressions that they have about other people well into a relationship. So this really goes to underscore the importance of making a good first impression with the people that you meet, whether it's a potential boss or colleagues or a romantic partner or in-laws or any other people that you might meet who are in important relationships in your life. It's very important to consider the importance of first impressions. And I'm sure many of you have heard the saying, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. This saying is based on the wisdom that has been acquired from many people before us, and it has definitely been found to be the case in the research as well. Attractiveness is another type of appearance-based nonverbal cue, and attractive people tend to enjoy lots of benefits in terms of perceptions that other people might have with them or of them. So, for instance, attractive people tend to be more popular than those people that are less attractive. Attractive people also tend to have more romantic opportunities than people that are less attractive. Attractive people a lot of times will get more job opportunities or professional career options than people that are less attractive. And so generally speaking, people that are more attractive tend to get better evaluations than people that are less attractive. However, in terms of attractiveness, it's important to point out that attractiveness can help people in terms of having an edge, like a positive edge, if you will, but that only tends to go and work so far. So for example, the research actually tends to find that although attractiveness tends to be something that improves the evaluations that other people have of other individuals, it only tends to hold to a certain point. And then if you are too attractive or too beautiful or too good looking, then actually being very attractive can actually work against you. So, you can think of situations maybe where you've been, maybe you've heard somebody say something like, oh, well, look how good looking that person is, but I'm sure that they're not, I don't know, maybe as smart as we are, or maybe as nice or such a good person, right? So there tends to be an assumption that attractive people are better at things, but if you're too attractive, then it can actually work against you. And people might also start to, think things or assume things like, well, you can't have everything in life. So if that person is that attractive, they must be lacking in some other important area, right? So it's kind of an interesting finding in the research about attractiveness. And what it goes to show you is that attractiveness is something that can be important, but it certainly is not the most important thing in relationships, right? Because I'm sure many of you at this point in your life have met other people who are very, very attractive physically, but then they open their mouth and you decide that you're not interested in getting to know them, right? So attractiveness is not just skin deep. It's something that people are looking for in terms of the substance of a person as well. So that's definitely something to think about. Clothing sends a good deal of messages about the values you have, the way you see yourself, who you want to be. So clothing is a very important part of nonverbal communication. You can also think of things like stylizing ourselves through accessories or different symbols. Some people like to wear clothing that gives them a link to their university. Other people want to wear different types of symbolisms that might connect them to a religious group. So these are all different ways that people might decorate themselves to send messages about who they are and how they see themselves. You can also tell a lot about people based on how neat they are and how well groomed they are, right? So do they wear clothing that is freshly pressed and clean? Do they have accessories that have been appropriately chosen? Do they tend to have their hair, teeth, and nails well groomed or not, right? And these are all things that say something about people. And of course, in the case of you or me, these are things also that might lead other people to have impressions about us in terms of our personality, our strengths, our weaknesses, right? So these are all things that we want to think about in terms of appearance. And as I've stated before in this lecture, there are a lot of things that we can do to manage our appearance so that we can give the impression that we want to give to people in life. And I encourage you to think about this, especially in situations where the stakes are high. So if you're on a job interview, obviously you want to think through the way in which you dress. You want to be careful about how you accessorize yourself so that you don't, behave or use accessories that are excessive or perhaps inappropriate for that given job. You certainly want to think about whether your clothing is neat and clean and pressed, ironed. You also want to think about other types of accessories you're using and whether that's appropriate. And I think that good grooming is probably one of the most important things to think about, because everybody wants to work next to someone that smells good and that, looks like they take care of themselves, right? So these are things to think about, especially with many of you who are getting ready to embark upon your professional careers. I'm sure that most of you are aware of the fact that romantic involvement also has a lot to do with appearance and how we carry ourselves. And generally speaking, people who tend to groom themselves well and tend to dress and attire themselves well also probably have, more options in terms of romantic interests as well. So these are all things to think about. Another type of nonverbal communication deals with physical space or the use of proxemics. And proxemics is an important thing to consider because based on the culture or society in which we live, there are certain types of physical space norms that we tend to adopt or accept as routine or normal, right? So, for example, physical distance between people is a type of a cultural social norm, right? And so most of us are aware of the fact that in order to really feel comfortable engaging in a conversation with another human being, we need to have a relative amount of distance between the other person and ourselves, right? So according to your textbook, the types of distances that people tend to consider to be normal in more Western U.S. culture is the distances that are laid out here on the slide, and I'm going to go through each of these one by one. So in terms of intimate close distances, so intimate distances would be the level of space, for instance, that you would find between like a mother and a child, like a mother and a child or a mother and a baby, right? And that would probably be between, 5 and 18 inches, and that would be considered an intimate space. You might also find that intimate space deals with romantic or, sexual interactions, right? Those are more intimate spaces. They tend to be a fairly close physical interaction. And depending on who you're interacting with, people have different preferences for space, but generally speaking, the intimate distance zone is about 12 to 18 inches. Now, the personal space zone deals more with people who we are close to but not intimate with, right? So this would include things like our sisters and brothers, maybe our good friends. You might have, certain types of relatives that you feel close to, and you might sit, a couple of feet away from them when your whole family gets together, and you might talk, and there's only two feet in between you two when you're discussing an issue. So that would be considered a personal space zone. And the social space zone deals with more distant social relationships. So these are people that we know, and maybe like colleagues at work, or people that you work with, or it from school, but that you're not really close with. And so that distance, the preferred distance there is between 4 and 12 feet. And then you have, of course, the public speech or the public communication distance. And this primarily deals with interacting in more public areas, such as when I'm in front of the class giving a speech, I tend to probably not be, any closer than 3 to 5 feet between myself and students at any given time, because I'm in a public speech environment. I might sometimes walk around the room and I might be, 4 to 5 feet close. I might have a 4 to 5 foot distance between myself and some students at certain points. But when I'm in front of the class, I'm probably hanging out more in terms of the public zone where there's like a 10-foot space between myself and the class. Territory is another interesting component related to physical space, and human beings are territorial, and actually animals are very territorial as well. So human beings tend to like to assume rights or ownership over certain types of space, right? So for instance, if you have a desk at school, you can think back to when you were growing up and, you go into elementary school and you each have, everybody has a desk, right? And so that would be like your territory, that's your space. And so you might, you have your things inside the desk and, you have the desk the way you like it. And, you might want to have your chair like a certain amount of distance away from the desk or whatever. But you can also see territory playing out in terms of people's cars, right? So people feel a sense of ownership in terms of their cars and the space that they have in the car or around the car. People also have territory expectations about social interactions, right? So if you go to the library, for example, you might notice if you go to study, if you go and take up a table, what are you going to do when you get to that table? Well, you're going to put your books, on the table, and you're going to try to claim the table as your territory non-verbally, right? And so these are various ways that we attempt to manage territory issues through our physical possessions. But territory also sometimes deals with issues related to status and power. So what's interesting about the research on gender and gendered performance is that generally speaking, men tend to take up a lot more space than women do. So if you ever notice how men and women sit like in a classroom or, in a theater or, at a restaurant or in an office or wherever, a lot of times you'll notice that men tend to sit in ways where they make themselves bigger than women do. So men will sit with their legs sort of just on the chair, maybe kind of a little bit open, or maybe they'll cross like their right leg. Maybe they'll put their right ankle up over their left knee, right? And so they have sort of a cross leg there thing. And so it kind of takes up a big amount of space. They might also have their arms kind of out on the edge of the chair, kind of marking that territory like that. Whereas if you tend to look at women, women tend to make themselves smaller, right? So women tend to sit down and they might cross their legs. And so, for modesty purposes, but even if you're wearing pants, you will see a lot of women who will sit and they cross their legs, one leg over the other, right? And they might even cross their arms, right? And so women tend to make themselves smaller and take up less space, whereas men tend to take up more space. And so a lot of research experts suggest that this has something to do with the need for territory, perceptions of status and power, and things like that. So it's a fairly interesting area to look at in terms of how we use nonverbal communication. We can also look at nonverbal communication in terms of the physical environment. So the way that people decorate their offices, their dorm rooms, their homes, right, their cars, all of these things send messages about who they are, what their values are, the way that they want to be, and things like that. So you can look at things like the way in which people design their home or the way that they decorate their home, right? What kinds of architecture do people prefer when they buy a house? Those types of things will send messages or will create an impression about what a person is like. You can also tell about somebody's personality, potentially. You can tell about whether they're intellectual or whether they're less intellectual or what kind of intellect issues they appreciate. You can tell a lot about someone's attitude or their family life based on how they decorate their office, right? So if you walk into a professor's office and you see that they have lots of bright colors and they, have a lot of pictures of their pets and their families in the office, that sends you a message about the things that that person holds to be near and dear, right? That tells you about what they think is important. And it also probably sends a message about their attitude and their disposition in life, right? Because presumably people who are happy or want to be happy are going to surround themselves with lighter, brighter, more beautiful things, right? And maybe people who are more scientific and, maybe more serious and more, focused and, things like that, maybe they don't decorate their offices in the same way, right? So the other thing to think about is that environment shapes the interactions that we have. So what this suggests is if you are someone who maybe suffers from seasonal affective disorder, right? And so seasonal affective disorder is the tendency that some people have in the winter time when there's a lack of sunshine. And by the way, sunshine gives us vitamin D, and vitamin D is something that a lot of people have a deficiency in. So it's worth going to the doctor and getting a blood test to see if you are vitamin D deficient, because a lot of people, especially in the wintertime, have a vitamin D deficiency because of a lack of sun. And oftentimes that can create people to feel depressed. And so if you do feel like you need to try to enhance your mood or try to improve your mood a little bit, sometimes you can think about your environment and how have you decorated your office or your dorm room or your house? And are you using colors and pictures and other types of physical stimuli that will make you feel happy and encouraged? Or do you have your space set up in a way where it's kind of dark and gloomy and things like that? Another thing to think about is relative neatness, cleanliness, and orderliness. I'm only speaking from my personal experience, but I am the type of person where if my home environment is neat and orderly and clean, I feel much better than if I'm dealing with a home environment that needs a lot of work. So that's something to think about in terms of the physical environment and how we can send messages about who we are, but it also tends to shape the way that we feel as well. And so it's definitely something worth considering. The last type of nonverbal communication that we're going to discuss in this chapter deals with time or chronemics. And a lot of times the issue of chronemics or time, or how we use time, or how responsible we are in terms of keeping time, might have something to do with perceptions of power, right? So in some cases, and I don't want to generalize because there are people, many people who are in positions of high power that are very cognizant of being respectful of the time that other people have, right? Or of respecting other people's time, okay? But generally speaking, we would expect, for example, that if you go to the doctor, that you are going to be probably accepting of the fact that you have to sit and wait in the waiting room for an extra 20 minutes than if you were just to go and try to meet a friend for coffee, right? So part of that expectation is based on the fact that the doctor is seen as someone who has a lot of power in society, right? The doctor has power to diagnose us. The doctor has power to give us something that will make us feel better. The doctor has power to write prescriptions, right? So you can think about this idea of power and how power can shape the impressions that people develop about time and the value of time and the value of your own time versus other people's time, okay? Another thing that's worth considering with regards to time and power is that sometimes people might send messages that are unintentional based on how they use time, right? So for example, if you tend to be someone who is chronically late, then the chances are you might be sending messages to other people about the views or attitudes that you have towards them based on the fact that you tend to be late a lot, okay? Generally speaking, when I have someone who keeps me waiting a lot, right? I mean, once in a while is one thing, right? But if you know someone where you set a time and they're constantly 15 or 20 minutes late, right? There's an impression that you might develop based on that behavior, right? And the impression may not always be positive, right? You might start to feel a little bit dismissed. You might start to feel a little bit irritated that every time you meet with the person that you go out of your way to make sure you're on time, and then this other person just doesn't bother to show up until 20 minutes into when you were supposed to be meeting. So you want to be very cognizant of time and of being punctual whenever possible, especially in professional situations, but even with friendships and family members as well, because you certainly, whenever possible, it's good to send a message of respect and concern and care, right? And so time is one way that people convey those attitudes or those ideas, and sometimes it may even be unintentional. So a good golden rule to think about is always, how would I feel if I was sitting waiting 20 minutes for somebody to show up, right? I probably wouldn't appreciate it, so I do my best to try to be on time whenever possible. So that's definitely something to think about. However, sometimes we run into issues where people have a different time orientation that's based on culture. So for example, where I grew up in the Hawaiian Islands, they have what's called Hawaiian time. And Hawaiian time is a general understanding that people have that, generally speaking, most meetings or most get-togethers or whatever are probably going to start a little bit later than the actual official start time, because everyone is running a few minutes behind because of Hawaiian time. Now, sometimes people who are from a monochronic culture, and monochronic cultures tend to be very focused on doing one thing at a time. They tend to be very punctual. So if you say that you are going to start a meeting at 10 a.m., the meeting starts at 10 a.m. on the dot, okay? However, other people are from cultural orientations that are polychronic, and people who are from polychronic cultural orientations tend to view time as more flexible. They might view performing various tasks at the same time as something that is seen as the norm or the preferable way to do things. And so you can clearly see how in these kinds of interactions where you have people from monochronic cultures interacting with people from polychronic cultures, there's an expectation about how we manage time that can sometimes contribute to communication misunderstandings, right? And so this is one of the reasons why it's really good to be in good communication with people, to check your expectations and to engage in perception checks whenever possible so that we can avoid having misunderstandings about things. So we have concluded this chapter, which deals with nonverbal communication. We've talked a lot about the various ways that nonverbal communication influence our lives. We've also talked about the different types of nonverbal communication, and hopefully you have learned some information here that will help you in terms of your interpersonal relationships and also your professional relationships as well. I do encourage you all to seek to understand your own nonverbal tendencies a little bit better so that you can start to make informed decisions about managing nonverbal cues. And also, I encourage you to try to pay attention more to the nonverbal cues that other people give you, because you may actually learn a lot about people just by watching what they do and how they do it. And certainly, you do need to pay attention to what people are saying verbally, but there is oftentimes a lot that is being said nonverbally that people will not tell you verbally. So it's always good to consider that. And thank you for your attention in this chapter. I hope that you have learned some useful information, and I will see you all in the next chapter.